Welcome to the Gen X Shift podcast, a show for Gen Xers who are navigating some pretty tough transitions and aren't sure how to move forward. I'm your host, Michele Walter, proud Gen Xer, former lawyer turned entrepreneur, huge Jason Momoa fan, and margarita snob. And I've navigated a lot of transitions in my life, from losing my mom suddenly to a heart attack to starting my own business. But I often did it all on my own because I was too stubborn to ask for help. Now I'm on a mission to give actionable strategies to other Gen Xers so that they can find the confidence, courage, and clarity they need to make a shift. So let's rock and roll. Hey, Gen Xers. Welcome to episode 1 of the Gen X Shift podcast. I'm your host, Michele Walter, and I'm so grateful to you for tuning into this episode, for coming along on this crazy adventure and ride with me. I am a vintage 1972 Gen Xer, so born right in the heart of the Gen X era. I'm also a former environmental attorney for the U.S. Department of Justice, turned entrepreneur, certified professional coach, certified mindfulness meditation teacher, and woman-owned small business. And I am here to be your compassionate, rebellious, no-nonsense, supportive guide as you try to navigate your way through the various transitions that a lot of us Gen Xers are facing at this time of our lives. So for this episode, I want to go over just a little bit of my backstory, just so you can get to know me a little bit, figure out, well, who's this woman that I'm listening to on this podcast? And know that on future episodes, there's going to be a lot of my life experiences and lessons that I'm going to come back to, because I think that through the power of storytelling, we can see ourselves in other people, and we can learn lessons from what other people have gone through and what they've experienced. So today we're just going to kind of scratch the surface a little bit on who I am. And then I want to give you an idea of why I'm here doing this podcast when there are 3.2 million other podcasts out in the world. And then a little bit about what the format and schedule will be like for the podcast. So are you ready? Let's rock and roll. So I was born and raised in rural Nebraska. I kind of think of myself as the female version of the Chris Farley character on Saturday Night Live, you know, the motivational speaker who lived in a van down by the river. Well, I grew up in a trailer down by the river for most of my life until we moved to a real house that was stationary on the west side of town, also out in the country. And growing up in rural Nebraska back in the 70s and 80s was pretty simple. And it was also a time when we got to just be kids, right? I remember I got to play down along the river by myself when I was very young. I got to play under the bridge, out in the trees in the forest, get dirty, get down in the dirt. And it was a time when we had a lot of freedoms, I think, as children. And growing up in Nebraska, I was pretty gifted, I think is what we called it at the time. I was a straight A student. I was in a gifted program in elementary school. So I was always kind of very driven and very much an overachiever. And for most of my life, I was very much a big fish in a small pond. And so school felt pretty easy for me. And life was actually pretty simple. Although I grew up in a trailer house, I still had privileges. I don't remember ever really wanting or lacking for anything, except maybe family vacations. The only vacation my family really took was to go to Nebraska Furniture Mart in Omaha for the weekend. That was our idea of a family vacation. But I spent my time playing with my friends in town, riding our bikes around town until the sun went down, going to Fun and Food to play video games, going to my best friend Sean's house because she lived in town and had cable. We didn't have cable living out in the country. And I remember watching Purple Rain for the first time at her house, watching The Outsiders, all the cool HBO movies, and MTV when it first came on. It was a pretty innocent kind of childhood, and I was pretty isolated from a lot of things, including very much diversity in our very small town in rural Nebraska. And my parents were both blue collar workers. My dad and his family were entrepreneurs all of their life. My dad and his folks owned a gas station right off of the interstate in Nebraska. And so I spent a lot of time at the gas station helping out, pumping gas, cleaning windshields, helping at my grandma's cafe where they had buffalo burgers that they made. And my mom, she stayed home with me until I went back to kindergarten or first grade. And then she became an office assistant. And for the rest of her life, pretty much worked 2 or 3 jobs. So as I got older, my life continued to be one of sort of a typical 70s and 80s kid. Spent a lot of time listening to 8-tracks. I remember the Grease 8-track. I also remember the Bee Gees album that had like the 3 gold albums on it. I still vividly remember that album cover, and it was like a trifold. It was just beautiful. Had their big faces inside. And then as I got into high school, I started partying a lot, like a lot of kids my age of that generation. And my senior year in high school, after several years of my parents not getting along very well, my parents decided to get a divorce. And so I took refuge in drinking and partying a lot. And as I started to move through my senior year, I don't really ever remember kind of planning out my future. I have just always been one of those people who've just kind of done what's in front of me, not really given a lot of thought to planning down the road. And so when it came time to think about going to college, I thought, well, I'll just stick to someplace close to home. Applied to one school, Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska. Went to Creighton for undergrad. I was a psych major. And I started to become a little bit smaller fish in a little bit bigger pond, but still did pretty well in school. Still was drinking and partying a lot. And then as I got toward the end of college, I had no idea what I was going to do with a psychology major. And so I thought, well, I'll go to law school. That sounds good. So I applied to Creighton University because, again, that was simple, and went to Creighton Law School. And as I was going through law school, I think that's the first time I really started feeling like I didn't measure up, because then the competitive nature of the legal field really kicked in and made me realize that I was actually a teeny tiny little minnow in a huge ocean. And I didn't realize until much later in life, looking back, how much that competitive atmosphere really impacted me and my self-worth and my confidence, which had already been pretty low, because for reasons I still don't understand, I lacked a lot of self-worth from a very young age. And so as I got through law school and started thinking about what I wanted to do, I found myself not really having a plan, and talked to a couple professors who did environmental law out in Washington, D.C., and said, hey, you should go out to D.C. and do this master's program in environmental law. And I thought, okay, that sounds good. So just kind of fell into that. And so I ended up moving from Nebraska to Washington, D.C., which was a huge transition, and was out in D.C. doing this master's program at George Washington University when I started doing an internship at the United States Department of Justice in the Environment and Natural Resources Division. And through that internship, I got to know the folks there, ended up getting hired there as an environmental litigator, even though I really probably didn't have a lot of business being there. I hadn't gone to a fancy schmancy law school. I wasn't on law review. I didn't clerk for a federal judge. But I got to know the people there, and they really liked me. They saw my work ethic, and so I got hired. And at first, it was pretty cool. There was a lot of pride, a lot of ego wrapped up in being a federal government litigator for the United States Department of Justice, representing the people of the United States in really sexy environmental law cases. And that lasted for a few years. I kind of rode that high for a few years. Having that kind of job in my early to mid 20s felt like a real ego boost. I felt like I found my path. It wasn't until several years into my career as a litigator that I started questioning whether that was actually my path. And I went to a law firm for a few years in the middle of my DOJ career and decided that a law firm really wasn't for me. And then when I was back at the Department of Justice in 2012, I got a phone call one morning that our mom had passed away suddenly from a heart attack while she was working late one night in her office at the age of 58. And that kind of news, for anybody who's gotten that kind of news, who's lost a parent or a child or somebody else significant, really takes the wind out of your sails. And I remember saying, as soon as I got that news, that I don't know how to do my life without my mom. Growing up, my mom had been my best friend, my biggest cheerleader. She was pretty young when she had me. She was 18. And then it was almost 11 years later that she had my brother. And so I'd always been kind of a built-in babysitter for my brother, like a lot of Gen Xers. Not only was I a latchkey kid, home after school, watching TV, doing my homework and cleaning house, but then I also babysat my brother because I was so much older than him. And so my parents had instilled me with a lot of responsibility. And all along the way, though, my mom was always one of my biggest champions. And so when she was gone, a lot of my confidence, my bearings in life were also gone. And so starting in 2012, I really started to question the path that I'd taken. I started to recognize that all throughout my legal career, and probably starting back in law school, that I'd never really figured out who I was, which I think is pretty normal for a lot of people. And I also started realizing that being a lawyer didn't feel like it was what I was here to do. For, again, reasons I don't quite understand, I'm somebody who from a very young age has been almost tortured by wanting to make the world a better place. And while I know the cases I worked on were important as a lawyer, I never really felt that tangible, noticeable impact that I wanted to have on the world. Plus, the cases were such long, drawn-out litigation, they really kind of sucked the life out of you at the end of the day. And so as I progressively got more depressed, more burnt out, more anxious, I was also doing marathons and Ironman triathlons, all to kind of fill some vision of who I thought I should be, maybe to fill some hole or to build myself back up again. And so in 2015, I came to Boulder, Colorado to do Ironman Boulder. And after spending some time here in Colorado, I decided that I wanted to move to Colorado. I wanted to be near the mountains. I wanted to be closer to my dad and my brother in Nebraska. And so I went back to my DC office and asked for a transfer to our Denver field office, and then put in place about a 1.5 year long plan to sell my townhouse in Arlington, Virginia, all by myself without a realtor, so I could pocket the extra cash and make the move, uproot my life of over 20 years in DC and move back across the country again to Colorado. And so in 2016, I made that move, this time with the help of my dad and my brother. Whereas when I moved to DC, it was with the help of my mom and my brother. My brother and I have helped each other move a lot over the course of our lives. So once I got to Colorado, I thought, okay, I'll feel better. Like the change of scenery is going to make me feel better. And it actually just made things worse because I really felt that I could not stay in an office all day when I had these beautiful mountains outside to go play in every day. And so my anxiety and depression and burnout just continued to spiral. And on top of that, I started feeling like I had no purpose. And honestly, there were some times, and there still are times, to be completely honest, that my thoughts got pretty dark and nihilistic, that I didn't see the point of me being here anymore, that I didn't think there was any meaning to my life because I wasn't doing something that was making the world a better place. And so why should I even bother? And so over those years after I moved to Colorado, I started really spiraling. And it wasn't until about 2018 that I met a couple of folks. This is a story I'll tell later on an upcoming episode. But I met a couple of folks, one of whom was a certified professional coach, and another one who was a certified mindfulness meditation teacher. And they told me about the training programs and certifications they'd gotten. And I thought, well, that sounds cool. Maybe those kinds of things would help me. And so I enrolled in a certified coaching program and a certified mindfulness meditation program at the same time that I was still working as an environmental litigator at DOJ, and put myself through both of those programs. And a few months into them, realized that if I continued to be a lawyer, it was probably going to kill me. And so I decided that I wanted to start my own business, take the teachings and the practices and the tools that I was learning that were slowly bringing me back to life, back into my purpose, and take those out into the world to others who were experiencing similar challenges. And so after a couple of months, I decided to hatch another 1.5 year long plan so that I'd get my 20 years in at the federal government so that someday I'll get a pension and do my business full time. So in June of 2021, I quit the Department of Justice. I did not retire. I am not collecting a retirement income at all, and have been doing my business, Life from the Summit, full time ever since. So now I use my certified professional coaching and my certified mindfulness meditation skills, as well as a lot of other practices and strategies that I have learned to support and guide and help other Gen Xers through the myriad of transitions that we're facing at this stage of life. And the reason that I'm here doing this podcast now is because what I have noticed in talking with my clients and talking with friends is that oftentimes we lack the knowledge and the connection to the insight and the power within us to know how and be able to take steps into making a shift in our lives. Sometimes we get forced into making a shift or a transition. And other times we kind of stand at the base of the mountain, just looking up at it, wondering, how am I going to make that happen? And what I have learned, and this was a hard lesson through losing my mom when she was so young, is that if we don't learn how to move through these shifts and transitions in our life, we will actually take our dreams to the grave. I know that my mom had a lot of dreams for herself, not only that she gave up when she had me when she was 18, dreams that my dad probably gave up when he had me when he was 24. But my mom also went to the grave, I know, with a lot of dreams on her heart, because she was one of those moms who took care of everybody else except herself. And so I want Gen Xers to know that whatever dreams you have, however small or big they are, whether it's just a dream of being able to fit into your skinny jeans or a dream of being able to buy a camper, like my dream, I want a Coachman Cross Trail 22 or 23 XG. Whatever your dream is, maybe you just want to retire with $5 million. That dream lies on the other side of the transition that you are finding yourself unable to make right now. And so I want to use this podcast to talk about my experience and what I've learned in going through transitions, and to bring on other badass Gen Xers and also some non-Gen Xers to talk about their wisdom and experience and what they've learned about making all kinds of different transitions. So we're talking about transitions from physical health and well-being to mental and emotional health, to planning for or saving for retirement, to your financial well-being, empty nesting, getting the kids off to college, maybe navigating this time of life as a single person or recently divorced, or somebody who is childless or child-free. Also caring for our aging parents and the transitions of losing our parents, losing children sometimes, losing friends, other people who are close to us at this age. So what I have been seeing and experiencing is that there are so many shifts that Gen Xers want to make. And oftentimes we get so comfortable where we are, even when we're miserable, that we're too afraid of the uncertainty to try to make that change. And so what happens is we let our dreams just live inside us instead of living them outside. And so when we can learn that age-old saying of the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know, why that keeps us in our comfort zone, then we can start learning how to move into and embrace the fear so that we can start moving out of our comfort zone into the growth zone, into realizing our dreams, into making the shifts that we want to make. So that's why I've started this podcast, is that I want this message of the teachings and practices that I've used and so many other folks have used to be able to navigate transitions to go out into the world and support you in some small way. So I really have 3 hopes of doing this podcast. The first one is that I want to share stories. I believe in the power of storytelling. This is why I just gave you a real brief overview of my story. There's going to be a lot that I'm going to come back to in future episodes, because even though our circumstances are probably very different, you might see some of yourself in my story, and you're going to see some of yourself in the stories of my guests that I have on. I've been having some amazing, powerful conversations, letting people tell the stories of their background and growing up in the 70s and 80s, and even some younger guests. I'll come back to that in a second. And telling the stories of their journeys through failure, through loss, through heartache, through challenges, through physical changes, losing their health, going through menopause, going through the loss of parents or children. And so I believe that power of storytelling can really plant some seeds for you in how you might want to move through your next transition. The second thing I want to do with this podcast is build bridges. I want to build bridges between Gen Xers and between our generation and other generations, which is why I'm going to have guests who aren't necessarily Gen Xers. So sorry to disappoint you. There's going to be some non-Gen Xers, because at the end of the day, it's all just a label, right? Like this is just like a label that we put on ourselves. And I think it can be fun and it can serve a purpose in understanding the time periods that we grew up in and how we were conditioned and the messages that we received growing up and how that's impacting us as adults. And at the same time, at the end of the day, it's just a label. And so I think every generation has wisdom and insights to share that other generations can learn from. And so I'm going to have some guests from other generations come on to share their wisdom and what they have learned in making transitions. So I believe that building bridges, both within the Gen X community and between our generations, is so powerful, especially with how the world is today. And I know that all throughout history, and even when I think back to our parents and grandparents, and they thought the world was going to hell in a handbasket, right? I know that every generation thinks that. And it also feels very true. But I believe at the end of the day, I want to start from our place of connection, from our place of humanity, remembering that we are all human beings and that everything that makes us different is worth cherishing, is worth honoring. And that just because we're different doesn't mean we can't have a bridge between us. And so I really want to use this podcast to encourage all of us to remember that and to build bridges, because that's how we move from one transition to the next. We got to figure out how to cross a bridge. And the third thing I want to do with this podcast is really connect this community of Gen Xers, because I remember when I was little in elementary school in particular, and my mom said, you will invite everybody to your birthday party. Think of this as one big birthday party. I want to invite everybody, because regardless of where you fall on any political, religious, spiritual, philosophical spectrum, I want to come back to that shared common humanity point, to building bridges, to remembering that we all have something to learn from each other. So I want to reconnect all of us Gen Xers, because remember, we might all be sitting in the nursing home together at some point, or on the front porch sitting in our rockers whittling, So let's remember that we at least have in common that we all kind of grew up in the same time period. So that's what I want to do with this podcast. So let me tell you a little bit about the schedule and the format. There will be new episodes every Tuesday. And I'm also toying with the idea, God help me, because this has been enough trying to get this launched into the world as it is. But I'm toying with the idea of doing an extra episode on Thursdays. That would be a shorty episode that would maybe give some highlights from the Tuesday episode, respond to listener questions, give some real tangible pieces of advice and strategies. So if that sounds interesting, let me know. The podcasts are going to be long form conversations. As I said, I believe in the power of storytelling. So I'm just letting the conversations with my guests let her rip, because there's so much goodness and juicy nuggets of wisdom that have been coming out in these conversations. So if you're like a short executive summary kind of person, this probably isn't the podcast for you. But you know what? The beauty of a podcast is you can hit pause and come back and finish listening later. So I want these conversations to flow and just be what they are. So they're going to be long form, in-depth conversations, because that's who I am. I'm a long form, in-depth kind of gal. I'm not short. I'm not superficial, because I believe in the deep work that we all need to do to make these transitions. So if that's you, come along. If it's not, it's okay. I also want you to know that there might be guests that you don't agree with. There might be things that we talk about that you don't agree with. There might be guests I don't agree with, and that's fine. Again, remember connection, building bridges, remembering our shared common humanity. And I invite you to lean into curiosity. Instead of lashing out in the comments on the episode webpage to somebody else, or telling me how much you hated the episode and how much it sucked, start with yourself. Get curious about what might be getting triggered or activated in you, and see if you can find some point of connection or find something to be curious about. Challenge those beliefs that you grew up with, because believe me, yes, we have a lot of strengths as Gen Xers, ton of strengths. And sometimes those strengths work to our disadvantage. For example, we love to brag about how independent and self-sufficient we are. And as I have learned over the last several years, that can actually be a real detriment to your growth and to being able to make a transition. Because I hate to tell you, honey, you need support. You need community from people. You need to be connected with other people if you truly want to make any shift and any growth in your life. So just remember to lean into curiosity first. That's my big invitation. So the podcasts are going to be on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts. I hope, dear God, I'm still figuring out the technology. Let me just say that I'm a one-woman show along with one dog. My chief canine officer, Winnie, she is my emotional support dog. She puts up with so much crap and anxiety from me. I love her to death. I don't know what I would do without her. She's actually a big reason that I started my own healing journey and was able to kind of find my way back. I'll talk about that in an upcoming episode. But because I'm a one-woman show, I am still figuring out the technology. The audio and the video quality is not where I want it to be. I'm super picky about that. I have a lot of audio issues myself with my hearing, that I like things to be of a certain quality, and I know they're not there yet. So please bear with me. Please be kind. Please know that I am working to figure all of this out right now by myself, and with Winnie's help when she can. So I ask for your patience and your grace and your kindness as I navigate, especially these initial few episodes, and get a lot of the technology figured out. So the podcast structure, as I said, going to be a lot of long form, in-depth conversations. We're going to talk about some nostalgia, and I also have lightning rounds at the end where we talk about some Gen X specific questions. But this is not a Gen X nostalgia podcast. There's a lot of those out there already, and they're great. So if you're here for just the nostalgia, this probably isn't your bag either. But I am going to be curious again about the time periods that we grew up in, how our Gen X strengths have both helped and not helped us, how we were influenced growing up by certain societal, cultural, familial messages that are still impacting us as adults. And so it's a little bit different Gen X flavor than just talking about nostalgia or music, which is all great. And we do talk about that a little bit, but the focus is more on, again, going a little bit deeper with some of the work that we need to do. So I want you to engage with me, engage with my guests. You can send emails and questions, topic suggestions. Even if you have a recommendation for a guest that you'd like me to interview, send emails to podcast@lifefromthesummit.com. Let me just say that my business, Life from the Summit, is the producer of this podcast. It's the engine that is making this podcast go. So everything that you will see is going to be through Life from the Summit. You can find all of the episodes at lifefromthesummit.com/podcast/the episode number. So this will be lifefromthesummit.com/podcast/1. And you can also find me on social media at Life from the Summit, pretty much everywhere. On LinkedIn, I'm Michele Walter. But I want you to send me comments. Again, engage with me. I really want this podcast to be here for you. So let me know what's resonating, what's not resonating, what you'd like to see, what you don't want to see. But again, be curious and kind. I can ask you to please be kind. And I also want to give a shout out to a lot of people without whom I would not be here. I mentioned my dog, Winnie, and I mean that with all sincerity. That dog has been a mirror for my anxiety and depression and burnout and really dark places. And the biggest reason that I started getting my shit together was because I saw how my moods, my energy was impacting her. And so really, I have to give a big shout out to Winnie, who is the most awesome dog on the planet. I also want to give a shout out to my mom, who, even though she's not here with me now physically, I know she's here with me because she instilled me with so many things that have helped me on this entrepreneurial journey. My resilience, my compassion, my desire to support other people. And I want to thank my dad because I really admire his entrepreneurial spirit. As I said, he's been an entrepreneur his whole life. And I really admire the resilience and the stick-to-itiveness that he has. And I want to thank my brother, who has been with me through a lot of shit. And I've been there with him. And he has always supported me and believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. And I want to thank all of my Nebraska childhood friends, a lot of whom I'm still really close with. I still have some of my best childhood friends from Nebraska. And they have always, always supported me, from being a lawyer, living in DC, doing triathlons, to moving back to Colorado and starting my own business. They have been just my angels. And so many of them were there for me when my mom passed away. And I also want to recognize all of my DC folks who are my family, my friends who turned into family, all the people that I worked with at DOJ who over the years became truly my second family. These were the people who scraped me up off the pavement after my mom died. And they also have continued to support me through every up and down, twist and turvy roller coaster ride that I've been on since I first met them. Gosh, almost 30 years ago now. And then I want to recognize my new Colorado friends, my coaching friends, my mindfulness friends, the other entrepreneurs that I have been so grateful to meet and the wisdom that they've shared. So I'm very lucky to be surrounded by communities of people that I have learned, especially in the last few years being an entrepreneur, to really lean on for support. And there are a few mentors that I want to shout out in particular who've been really helpful to me the past couple years. The first one is my mentor, my guide, Maisha T. Hill, and her community of Check Your Privilege and the Co-Conspirators Lounge. I'm going to reference all of these in the show notes. But Maisha and her teachings, her wisdom and her guidance have been fundamental for me learning as a white person what it means to really lean into community, to recognize the privileges I have, and to know that it's okay to ask for support and help, even when it's really uncomfortable. I also want to recognize Dr. Adia Gooden, who is someone I found on the Insight Timer meditation app one day when I was looking for information on imposter syndrome. And Dr. Gooden is an expert when it comes to imposter syndrome and self-worth, especially for women. So I have had the privilege of getting to work with her in group settings and getting to know her over the years. And she has also been a big reason why I am here and on this journey. Another big reason that I am on this journey is one of the coaches from my coaching school, the Institute for Professional Excellence in Coaching, IPEC, and her name is Bridget Simmons. And I remember being on a call with Bridget one day when I was still working at DOJ, and I didn't know how I was possibly going to survive being a lawyer for another year. I just wanted to say, screw it and be done with it. And Bridget taught me the gift, the importance of connecting into my core values to use those as sustainable fuel to get me through that year and a half of being a lawyer so that I could start my own business. So I owe her a lot. And the last mentor I want to thank is Chris Cowden and his podcast launch strategy and his podcast launch community on Facebook, which has been vital in me getting this podcast off the ground. So if you're thinking of starting a podcast, I highly recommend reaching out to Chris and using his podcast launch strategy. So I think that's about it. That was a lot of ground to cover. If you're still here, I appreciate you. I want to, first of all, ask a couple of favors and then end with a story. The favors I want to ask are, number one, if you could please rate and review the podcast on whatever platform you're listening. Those ratings and reviews go so far in getting the podcast recognized and moving it up in the algorithm. So it's super helpful. And it's so important to me that this podcast get out in the world to Gen Xers who really need the support. The second thing is if you can just share this podcast with at least one friend and ask them to share it with somebody else. And lastly, if you can support the podcast, especially as a one woman, one dog show, that would be great. I'll put the link in the show notes, but it's at Buy Me a Coffee. And if you feel resourced to donate to the podcast to help with the tech and all the resources and everything that it takes to produce this, I'd be deeply grateful. So I want to end with a story. And it harkens back to the movie The Outsiders, which if you haven't seen The Outsiders in the last 30 or 40 years, spoiler alert. But The Outsiders was one of my favorite movies. It was one of those movies I'd go to my friend Sean's house and watch. It really spoke to me. It still does speak to me about the innocence of our childhood, about the rebellious nature a lot of us had, and about connection. And if you remember, there's a scene where after Johnny, who was Ralph Macchio, kills one of the Socs, and he and Ponyboy, C. Thomas Howell, are on the run and they're hiding out in a church. And they're watching a sunset. And Johnny comments on how beautiful it is. And Ponyboy says, "Nothing gold can stay." And then he recites the poem, "Nothing Gold Can Stay" from Robert Frost. And when I heard that poem, I committed to memorizing that poem because it touched me so much. So if you haven't heard the poem or you're not familiar with it, it goes, "Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down to day. Nothing gold can stay." I love that poem and that scene in the movie because it's such a great reminder of how temporary everything is. Where you are now is temporary. Any transition that you're wanting to make is temporary. We are temporary. And we can't stay. That gold can't stay. And there's also an interesting paradox I want to point out. At the end of the movie, when Johnny's in the hospital because he got badly burned by trying to rescue some kids from the burning church and he's dying, and Ponyboy is there with him, Johnny looks up at Ponyboy and says, "Stay gold, Ponyboy." The paradox is that although nothing gold can stay, there is a gold that's permanent. And that's the gold that is deep inside us. The gold that's gotten buried and forgotten by decades of conditioning into who we think we're supposed to be, what we think is supposed to be important to us, what path we think we're supposed to be on. The gold that's gotten buried under all these external expectations, that's gotten buried underneath all those notions of being fiercely independent and self-sufficient. There is gold in each and every one of you, and that does not go away. And that's what I'm here to help you tap into, so that you can use that gold as your greatest source of wisdom and insight to help you move through any transition in your life. And so let me end by saying, stay gold, Gen Xers.